Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video I have combined two previously published videos in my series on postcolonial concepts, namely appropriation and abrogation. And the reason I'm putting them both together is because these two terms are usually often confused and go hand in hand. And I thought if I put them together in one video, maybe you can watch one and then watch the other one immediately after that comparatively. As always, if you have any questions after you watch them, please put them in the comments and I'll be very happy to answer them. And if you have a few moments, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't, so that you get timely notifications. Thank you so much, and here we go with the two videos combined in one. Good morning or good evening. I'm here today to introduce another postcolonial studies concept, appropriation, which is usually used in juxtaposition with abrogation. And there is a video on abrogation, which I'll post a link to down below. Appropriation is a related concept. Most of the times in postcolonial societies, an act of appropriation happens when the native writers, artists, even politicians appropriate or use the languages, the aesthetics, the ways of expressing introduced by the colonizers in their written works, in their political speeches, but then infuse it with the local traditions and customs. But by and large, what they're trying to do is, in opposition to abrogation, they're not trying to absolutely replace the language of the colonizers. They're actually mastering it and using it, which would be like another way of saying to dismantle the master's house with his or her own tools, right? So most of the times, let's say in literary tradition, these are the people who use the Western languages, French, Italian, English, to tell stories, to write stories. Now, the stories would be of their own native culture or maybe the contact phase of their culture with the colonizers, but they would also show a certain degree of mastery of the language. Sometimes they would insist that that's the only language that they can write in. But anytime they do that, anytime they appropriate or use the colonial languages or colonial ways of expressing to tell their stories, that's an act of appropriation and can be a revolutionary act. Now, there is a debate, especially in African postcolonial studies, about whether or not appropriation is a good fit for the post-colonies. So, for example, people like Chinua Achebe and others who mostly wrote in English would consider appropriation and a worthy pursuit. I mean, Achebe was famously known for saying that English maybe is a gift that the colonizers left us. On the other hand is the group of scholars and writers, people like Chinweizu, Ngugi, Thiong'o. I have videos on both of them, and I'll post links down below, who argue that it is important for the people from the post-colonial nation states to recover their own languages, their own literary traditions, and to write in them, because appropriation for them, at the end of the day, is still playing the game of the colonizers and following the rules of the language and literariness that they left behind. So on the whole, to sum up, appropriation happens when the natives of colonized cultures learn the languages of their colonial masters, master their philosophies, their forms, their genres, and then start producing literature and art in them. And that act of appropriation can sometimes be a revolutionary act because it uses or appropriates the master's language to undo the logic of the master's own imperatives and culture. But as I said, there is a debate about it. Now, Chinweizu, famously in his book Decolonizing the African Mind, absolutely is for a kind of cultural abrogation and not appropriation. And I have a brief lecture on Chinweizu's take on that. And in that, he also, appropriates two characters from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, Ariel and Caliban, and then suggests and theorizes that the native elite that is left behind, the elite who would be more attuned to appropriating the Western customs and culture, are the one who still represent the interests of the colonizers, and that the job or the work of post-colonial scholars and artists is to empower Caliban and hence use the native knowledge, native customs, and native traditions to recreate a modern Africa, right, in Chinweizu's words, but still informed by its own history, its own retrieved history. So overall, always read appropriation in comparison with abrogation. And then the term is also now used in metropolitan cultures where there is a term people use, oh, this is cultural appropriation. And that is the term used as a derisive term for any group from the dominant culture when they are trying to look like Africans or appropriate the mode of dress or music. I think most of the times it would be considered a negative thing of cultural appropriation because they are either monetizing that or politicizing an act of wearing clothes from Asia or somewhere else. But it has also now become a negative term, especially cultural appropriation in the metropolitan cultures themselves. So that's my brief video on appropriation. I will keep producing these conceptual videos, and I'll try to post most of the links and connect them in the description of all these videos. If you have any ideas or any concepts that you would like me to create a video on, please feel free to put that in the comments below. And please, if you like the content on this channel, do subscribe. And thank you so much, and I will see you next time. And today's concept is abrogation. And just to be fair, most of my definitions come from Bill Ashcroft et al.'s edited volume, Key Concepts in Postcolonial Theory, and I'll post a link to it in the description. Also, I'm using some of these entries from my own website, postcolonial.net. There is a glossary there, so I will post a link there. If you are new to my channel, please take a few moments to subscribe so that you can stay updated of what other materials, educational and other, I continuously post, and that you can also join some of my live webinars. So coming to abrogation, as a concept, it literally means what it means in the dictionary, to abrogate something, to cancel something out. In postcolonial theory, an act of abrogation is when a scholar or a writer takes up the European norm, like Eurocentric norm in language, and then either breaks it down and replaces it with something native or something informed through the native culture. But in the process of doing that, what they are doing is they are playing with the awareness of the normative structure of language as established by European powers, and then tweaking it so that it becomes their own, but also that it breaks down the normative aspects of that colonial language. Furthermore, it can also take up certain Eurocentric pre-established ideas of life, of self, of world, and superimpose upon them their own native ways of looking at things. In both its forms, what an act of abrogation does in literary theory, in scholarly writing, as well as in creative writing, is that it understands the normative standard established by the colonial powers, French, English, Italian, anyone else, and then it superimposes on it or replaces it with a native way of thinking, native way of writing, or native way of dealing with reality. And if you go beyond that philosophically, any philosophies, nativist or others, but post-colonial philosophies that proffer a different way of reasoning, a different way of offering explanations of the world, maybe retrieved from their own past, juxtaposing it against the Eurocentric norm, and then offering that as an alternative would also be an act of abrogation. So pretty much what it does is it basically erases any Eurocentric view or way of representing things and replaces it with some kind of retrieved, native, even pre-colonial way of looking at things. It can be in history, where you can pick up a normal, standard history account of an event and then completely abrogate it, replace it with a native account, with an account by those who were conquered. In literary studies, a great example of it is in linguistic terms, right? Taking away the normative representation of European languages. Instead of writing in perfect English, authors play with the language itself. For example, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children is a great example what he does in that language without glossing in Hindi, Urdu, Persian words. Another great example is Amos Tautola's famous novel, The Palm Wine Drinker, right? One of the first African novels, and that abrogates the novelistic form itself, the way it tells the story. When you read it, it's written in English, but it's a different kind of English. And the narrative structure itself doesn't match any of the European models of what is considered a novelistic representation. Beyond literature, in the realms of culture, then an act of abrogation would involve changing practices, what we do in life, or thinking about life, or thinking about actions, not necessarily in European terms or in terms established by Europe and European colonial powers, but in terms as informed by the native cultures, the native histories. Mostly the term abrogation also, it's other in a way, is appropriation. And appropriation is when the natives or the native writers, they appropriate European forms, European ways of expression, and then infuse them with their own knowledge. Abrogation is, of course, a more sphere form where you're not just appropriating the European forms for your own purpose, you're actually replacing their logic, their way of doing things, their way of believing in certain historical tropes or historical facts, and replacing them with the knowledge of your own. So that, in a nutshell, replacing the Eurocentric norm with the knowledge, practices, historiography, and literary tropes of your own native culture would then be considered an act of abrogation. Thank you so much, and there'll be more of these lectures. Thank you so much for joining me, and please do subscribe if you like the content and if you want to stay up to date about what I'll be doing next. Thank you and goodbye.